When Sofia Morales and her brother Alejandro crossed into the U.S., they believed they had escaped danger. They thought they had left behind the fear, the threats, and the life that had made every day a fight to survive. They were wrong. Because the real nightmare wasn't in the country they left behind. It was waiting for them, in uniform. Officer Ethan Thompson was supposed to protect them. A CBP officer, a man with authority, a man with power. At first, he seemed like a savior. He processed them quickly, made sure they weren't sent back. He even offered them a place to stay. Alejandro believed they had found an ally. Sofia wasn't so sure. Then one night, she vanished. No warning. No goodbye. Just gone. Ethan reassured Alejandro. "I'll handle it," he said. But days turned into weeks. Sofia was nowhere to be found. And then, a hiker made a gruesome discovery. Buried beneath the dirt was a secret that would unravel a horrifying truth. What happens when the one sworn to protect is the one you should have feared all along? Stay with us, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see the badge forever. Before we go deeper into the story, we welcome you to our channel, True Crime Zone HQ. Thank you to all our viewers and a special shout out to our subscribers for your continued support. Together, we strive to improve and bring you daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Sofia Morales had never known a life without fear. At 17, she had already seen more than most would in a lifetime. She and her older brother, Alejandro, lived in a neighborhood where survival meant obeying unspoken rules, where stepping out of line, even slightly, could mean death. Gangs ruled the streets, enforcing their own version of law and order. Families like the Morales were caught in an endless cycle of threats, extortion, and violence. There were no second chances. Sofia had witnessed neighbors disappear, friends recruited into lives they never wanted, and young girls forced into relationships with men who carried guns and wielded power without consequence. For the Morales siblings, the choice was clear: stay, and risk losing everything, or leave and take their chances elsewhere. They had heard stories of the United States, of people finding safety, jobs, and a fresh start. But getting there was another battle entirely. One night, after another threat from a gang that had marked them for recruitment, Alejandro made the decision. They packed what little they had and left their home behind, knowing they might never return. The journey ahead would test their will to survive in ways they never imagined. They weren't the only ones running. Along the way, they met others who had similar stories: families fleeing from violence, young mothers carrying children too weak to cry, men who had lost everything to warlords and drug cartels. They moved in silence, watching for danger, avoiding roads where criminals preyed on the vulnerable. Crossing borders meant walking through miles of unforgiving terrain, scorching deserts, dense jungles, rivers that swallowed those who misjudged their depths. They had no guide, only whispers of the safest paths and the constant, gnawing fear that one wrong step could mean the end. Food was scarce. Sleep was a luxury. Every town they passed through came with its own risks: corrupt police, traffickers waiting to snatch the defenseless, locals who would turn them in for a reward. The worst part was the uncertainty. Every checkpoint could be the one that sent them back to the life they were trying to escape. And yet, they pushed forward. Their mother's last words echoed in their minds: find a place where you can be safe. A place where you don't have to live in fear. After weeks of exhaustion, hunger, and close calls that left them shaken, they finally arrived at the border, the last barrier between them and the life they had sacrificed everything for. What awaited them wasn't the sanctuary they had dreamed of. It was a processing center, cold and impersonal, where hundreds of people sat in limbo, waiting to learn if they would be allowed to stay or sent back to the nightmare they had escaped. Sofia clutched Alejandro's hand as officers called names, sorted families, and made decisions that would determine their fate in a matter of minutes. And then, there was Ethan Thompson. To the outside world, Ethan was the embodiment of an honorable law enforcement officer, disciplined, professional, and a man dedicated to protecting the country's borders. As a GS-11 CBP officer, he had worked for years processing those who crossed into the United States, ensuring security and enforcing immigration laws. His peers respected him, his superiors valued his efficiency, and the community saw him as a steadfast protector of order. Beyond the uniform, he was a husband and a father, married to Sharon Thompson, a woman who had once been the love of his life. Together, they had built a family, raising their 2 daughters, Ella and Harper, in what looked like a stable and respectable home. The framed photographs on the walls of their house painted a picture of happiness, smiling faces, joyful family vacations, and celebrations captured in still moments. But appearances can be deceiving, and behind the carefully maintained illusion, Ethan's reality was far from perfect. His marriage, once built on love and companionship, had deteriorated into something mechanical, a relationship held together more by obligation than affection. The financial pressures of raising a family on a government salary weighed on him heavily, creating tensions at home that neither he nor Sharon could fully address. The man who had once felt a sense of purpose in his job now found himself increasingly dissatisfied, his daily work feeling routine, repetitive, and devoid of meaning. Yet, there was one thing Ethan still valued: control. In a life that was slipping further from his grasp, the ability to dictate the fates of others, to determine who stayed and who was sent back, gave him a sense of power that he couldn't find anywhere else. The day Sofia and Alejandro Morales arrived at the border station should have been like any other. For Ethan, processing immigrants was a procedure he had repeated countless times. Each case had its details, but in the end, they all blurred into one another: names, faces, desperate stories, and the weight of decisions that weren't truly his to make. But when he saw Sofia, something shifted. She was 17 years old, standing close to her brother, her expression a mix of exhaustion, apprehension, and silent hope. Unlike so many others who arrived with hardened expressions from years of suffering, she still carried a belief in the possibility of safety. Her features were delicate, her skin lightly sun-kissed from the long journey, her long dark hair falling over her shoulders. There was an innocence about her, a quiet vulnerability that struck him in a way he couldn't ignore. Her older brother, Alejandro, stood protectively beside her. At 21 years old, he had already taken on the role of guardian, his stance tense, his eyes filled with the weight of responsibility. The journey they had taken was not one of choice but of necessity, and now that they had reached what they believed was safety, they were at the mercy of the officers who decided their fate. Ethan's eyes lingered on Sofia, longer than they should have. It was only a few seconds, but in his mind, it felt like something significant had passed between them. He could sense her hesitation, the slight shift in her posture, the way she avoided direct eye contact. He was used to reading people, he had to be in his line of work, and in that moment, he saw 2 things in Sofia Morales: fear and trust. He leaned forward slightly, keeping his tone calm, steady, almost reassuring. "You're lucky," he said, his gaze never leaving her. "I can make sure you're not sent back. But you'll need to trust me." Alejandro's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension in his face easing just a little. He didn't question the offer, nor did he hesitate before nodding in agreement. They had no legal status, no other options, and if this officer was offering them a lifeline, rejecting it could mean deportation, or worse. Sofia, however, did not respond immediately. Something about the way Ethan spoke made her stomach tighten. She knew what it felt like to be in the presence of power, to sense when someone was holding control over you, and something about the way he looked at her made her feel exposed. But she said nothing. Her brother was desperate, and they had no leverage to question generosity when survival was at stake. Ethan took note of her reluctance, but rather than pushing, he softened his approach. He shifted his attention to Alejandro, speaking in a voice that carried the weight of authority but also a quiet understanding. "It's not official, but I know how to help people like you. You want your sister to be safe, don't you?" The words sealed their fate. Alejandro agreed before Sofia could say anything. There was no discussion, no debate, no moment to question whether or not this was the right decision. Ethan had offered them safety, and Alejandro had accepted it on their behalf. For Ethan, that moment was pivotal. The choice had been made, and now they were under his watch. They belonged to him. He offered them a place to stay. To Alejandro, Ethan's generosity felt like a blessing, an answered prayer at a time when they had nothing. Having a place to stay, even if temporary, meant security, a chance to settle without fear of immediate deportation. It meant not having to sleep in shelters or in the streets, where they would be vulnerable to those who preyed on the undocumented. For Sophia, however, something did not feel right. She wanted to believe in the officer's kindness, in the idea that someone with power was actually willing to help without expecting anything in return. But that wasn't how the world worked, and deep down, she knew it. At first, she told herself that she was just being overly cautious, that her instincts were on high alert after everything they had endured. But the way Ethan looked at her, the way he lingered a little too long, the way his presence in their lives became more frequent than necessary, made her uneasy. The house he provided was small but comfortable, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood where no one would ask questions. Alejandro quickly found work at a local mechanic shop, sending money back home to what remained of their family in Honduras. With him gone for long hours, Sophia was left alone in the house during the day, adjusting to a new life that, on the surface, seemed safe. But safety was an illusion. Ethan began visiting more often, always with an excuse. He brought groceries, checked in to make sure they were settling in, and stayed longer than necessary. His presence was constant, and while Alejandro saw it as an extension of kindness, Sophia saw it as something else entirely. The first time he touched her, it was subtle. A hand on her shoulder, a moment of unnecessary closeness. She convinced herself it meant nothing, that she was imagining things. But the gestures continued, and each time, they lingered a little longer. One evening, while Alejandro was working late, Ethan arrived unexpectedly. He brought food, wine, and a warm smile that, to anyone else, would have seemed friendly. But as the evening progressed, the shift in his behavior was unmistakable. He sat closer than usual, his voice softer, almost conspiratorial. "You know I could lose everything for helping you," he murmured, his hand resting lightly on her knee. "I've done a lot for you and your brother. Maybe it's time you show me some appreciation." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She felt the walls closing in, the weight of unspoken expectations crushing down on her. She had known this was coming. She had seen it in the way he looked at her, in the subtle touches, in the power he wielded over them. She was trapped. And there was nothing she could do about it. So she let it happen. And it wasn't just once. Each time, she told herself it would be the last. Each time, she hoped that if she stayed quiet, if she gave him what he wanted, he would lose interest. That he would let them go. But Ethan never lost interest. He only tightened his grip. What would you do in Sophia's place? Was Alejandro blind to the danger, or was he simply out of options? Let us know in the comments, and if you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel. Then one morning, Sophia felt a wave of nausea so strong that she barely made it to the bathroom in time. At first, she thought it was just exhaustion or the stress of carrying the weight of a secret too terrible to bear. But the feeling didn't go away. She began noticing other changes: fatigue, dizziness, a strange tightness in her stomach. She tried to ignore it, but deep down, she already knew what it meant. When she finally worked up the courage to buy a pregnancy test, she sat in the bathroom for what felt like an eternity before daring to look at the results. 2 pink lines. Positive. The sight of it made her whole world tilt. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't supposed to be in this position. She was only 17, undocumented, and alone in a foreign country. And the father? The man who was supposed to be her protector. A married officer who had used his power to trap her in an affair she never wanted. Her first instinct was to tell Alejandro, but fear stopped her. How could she? How could she explain what had been happening without breaking his heart? Without making him feel like it was his fault for trusting Ethan? Without risking the fragile roof over their heads? Instead, She stayed quiet, hoping to figure it out on her own. But Alejandro wasn't blind. He noticed how she stopped eating, how she was constantly sick, how she seemed distant and distracted. He asked if she was okay, if she needed to see a doctor. But before Sofia could answer, Ethan intervened. "She's just stressed," he told Alejandro with a casual chuckle. "It's a big change, living in a new country. Give her some space." And Alejandro, still believing Ethan was their savior, nodded and let it go. But Sofia couldn't let it go. Not anymore. The next time Ethan came over, she sat across from him, hands clenched in her lap, heart pounding in her chest. She didn't sugarcoat it. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's smile didn't falter, but she saw the way his hands tightened around his beer bottle, how his whole body seemed to go rigid in an instant. She expected him to deny it, to tell her it wasn't his. But he didn't. He knew it was. And she knew exactly what he was thinking. His career. His reputation. His family. His wife and daughters. Ethan had spent years crafting an image of himself as an honorable man. A respected officer. A loving husband. A devoted father. But if the truth came out, if anyone knew that he had not only been involved with a teenage girl but had gotten her pregnant, everything he had built would be destroyed. "You need to get rid of it," he said, his voice tight. Sofia felt her stomach drop. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You don't understand," Ethan pressed, his voice lowering into something more desperate, more dangerous. "This isn't just about you. If people find out, I lose everything. You lose everything." "I said no," Sofia repeated, firmer this time. Ethan stared at her, the anger in his eyes barely concealed behind the mask of calm he was so used to wearing. "You don't have a choice, Sofia," he finally said. But she did. For the first time in months, she felt like she did. She stood up, backing away from him. "I'm keeping it," she said. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," she shot back. Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Okay," he said, "if that's what you want." But something in his voice sent ice through Sofia's veins. For the first time, she saw it clearly, he wasn't going to let her walk away from this. And she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. "What would you have done if it was you? But remember, you're undocumented, you're always living in fear, you don't want to associate with authorities to avoid deportation. Tell us in the comments below." Ethan Thompson had spent years controlling every aspect of his life. At work, he was seen as a dedicated officer, one who followed the rules, protected the border, and carried himself with the authority his badge granted him. At home, he was the devoted husband, the father of 2 daughters, the man who went to church on Sundays and attended community events with a practiced smile. He had built his life carefully, making sure every piece fit perfectly into the image he had cultivated. But Sofia threatened to ruin all of it. Her defiance had thrown everything off balance. For months, she had been under his control, compliant, silent. But now, she had made a choice he couldn't accept. She had refused to end the pregnancy. She had backed him into a corner. And if there was one thing Ethan Thompson couldn't stand, it was losing control. He spent days thinking about what to do. At first, he tried to convince himself that maybe he could talk her into it, that maybe she would come around. But every time he saw her, the way she avoided him, the way she seemed more certain than ever about keeping the baby, he knew she wasn't going to back down. And so, he made a decision. Ethan had always been careful, and this would be no different. If Sofia simply disappeared, people would assume she ran away. Alejandro would be upset, of course, but undocumented immigrants went missing all the time. No one would ask too many questions. No one would dig too deep. And if they did, Ethan had enough connections to make sure the case went nowhere. He approached her with a different tone, softer, almost understanding. He told her he wanted to talk, that he wanted to help her. He promised that they could figure things out together, that maybe he had reacted badly before, but he was ready to listen now. He suggested they take a drive, just the two of them, to talk somewhere private where no one could interrupt. Sophia hesitated at first, but in the end, she agreed. Maybe a part of her wanted to believe him. Maybe she thought, just for a moment, that Ethan truly did want to make things right. But Ethan had no intention of fixing anything. He drove her to a secluded area, a stretch of abandoned land near the outskirts of town where no one would see them. There, under the guise of making peace, he handed her a bottle of water he had brought along. He watched as she took a sip, waiting for the moment the drug would take effect. It didn't take long. Within minutes, Sophia's vision blurred, her limbs growing heavy as confusion set in. She tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but her words came out slurred. Ethan caught her before she could collapse. He held her as her body went limp, whispering to her in a voice that no longer carried any of the warmth he had pretended to have before. "I told you, Sophia," he murmured. "You didn't have a choice." And then, he wrapped his hands around her throat. She was barely conscious, unable to fight back as he pressed down, his grip tightening. It was quick. He made sure of that. He had no intention of drawing it out, of letting her suffer any more than necessary. When it was over, he exhaled, staring down at her body, at the girl who had once looked at him with fear and trust. She would never look at him again. Ethan had come prepared. He had brought a shovel, and had already picked a spot where he would bury her. The dirt was loose enough to make digging easier, but he didn't take any chances. He worked fast, covering her body in a shallow grave before stepping back to make sure there were no obvious signs of disturbance. By the time he got back into his car, it was like she had never existed. Alejandro came home that night expecting to see his sister, maybe exhausted from a long day, maybe waiting for him to bring food from the shop. Instead, he found an empty house. The lights were off, her things untouched, no note, no sign that she had gone anywhere. At first, he wasn't alarmed. Maybe she had gone out for a walk, maybe she was at the store. But as the hours passed and she didn't return, the unease settled in. He called her phone, no answer. He asked the neighbors, no one had seen her. By the time midnight came and went, panic took over. There was only one person he could think to call. Ethan. When Alejandro told him Sophia was missing, Ethan barely hesitated before responding. "She probably just ran off," he said casually. "She's young, she's been stressed. Maybe she needed some time alone." Alejandro wasn't convinced. "She wouldn't just leave without telling me," he said, his voice sharp with worry. Ethan sighed, like he was dealing with a nervous child. "I'll handle it, okay? Let me ask around, see if anyone's heard anything." "You don't want to involve the police, do you?" The implication was clear. Alejandro, undocumented, alone, couldn't afford to attract attention. If he pushed too hard, if he caused trouble, the consequences could be worse than losing his sister. And so, reluctantly, Alejandro let it go. But he didn't stop looking. Days passed. Then weeks. Sophia never returned. Alejandro barely slept. He couldn't focus at work. His sister was gone, and there was nothing he could do. Until one day, a friend noticed the change in him. Someone Alejandro had trusted, someone who had seen the way he carried himself like a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders. When they asked him what was wrong, Alejandro hesitated at first. But then, for the first time, he told someone the truth. He told them about Ethan, about how the officer had taken them in, how he had been overly involved in Sophia's life. How, just days before she vanished, she had confided in him about her pregnancy. That friend, horrified, knew they needed help. With the assistance of an immigrant advocacy group, Alejandro filed a missing persons report. It wasn't easy, the authorities were slow to act, reluctant to prioritize the disappearance of an undocumented girl. But the report was filed, and the truth was set in motion. At the same time, something else happened. A pair of hikers, walking through the outskirts of town, stumbled upon something strange. A patch of dirt that looked disturbed. Curious, they stepped closer, and as one of them nudged the soil with their boot, a foul smell filled the air. They called the police. When investigators arrived, it didn't take long before they uncovered the remains. Sofia Morales, buried in a shallow grave. Alejandro's worst fear had become reality. His sister hadn't run away. She had been taken from him. The discovery of Sofia's shallow grave sent a shockwave through the small town. News spread fast, first as whispers, then as urgent headlines plastered across local media. A young immigrant girl had been found murdered, her body hidden away like an inconvenient secret someone had hoped would never be unearthed. But it was what the forensic team uncovered next that turned this from a tragic disappearance into a full-scale criminal investigation. The autopsy revealed what Alejandro had feared but had no way to prove: Sofia had been pregnant at the time of her death. Her body showed no signs of defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, but the bruising around her neck and the damage to her airway left no doubt. She had been suffocated. Someone had made sure she wouldn't live to tell her story. The investigators knew this wasn't random. Sofia hadn't been the victim of an opportunistic crime. Someone had gone to great lengths to make her disappear. And that meant they had left behind a trail, no matter how carefully they had tried to cover their tracks. It didn't take long for law enforcement to begin piecing things together. The first red flag came from Alejandro's statement. He had insisted from the very beginning that Sofia wouldn't have just run away, that she had been acting strangely in the days leading up to her disappearance. When asked if there was anyone in her life who might have had a reason to harm her, he hesitated. But eventually, the truth spilled out. Sofia had been seeing someone. Someone much older. Someone powerful. A CBP officer. Ethan Thompson. Investigators initially approached Ethan as a witness, not a suspect. After all, he had been the one Alejandro trusted when Sofia went missing. He had been the one to assure him that she had probably left on her own. When questioned, Ethan played the role of a concerned officer well. He expressed shock, feigned heartbreak at the discovery of Sofia's body, and even offered his condolences to Alejandro, claiming he had done everything he could to help. But his performance started to unravel as soon as detectives pulled security footage from traffic cameras near the site where Sofia had been buried. There, plain as day, was Ethan's vehicle, captured on multiple cameras on the night Sofia vanished. His truck, unmistakable with its minor dent on the side, had been seen traveling toward the remote area around the time of the suspected murder and returning nearly an hour later. Still, Ethan had an explanation for everything. He claimed he had been off duty that night, that he had gone for a drive to clear his head. That he had no reason to be involved in Sofia's death. But then the text messages surfaced. Sofia had kept everything. A digital trail of every conversation, every desperate plea, every threatening demand Ethan had sent her in the days leading up to her disappearance was still stored on her phone. Investigators recovered messages where Ethan had insisted she fix this problem before it ruined both their lives. There were messages warning her to not make this harder than it needed to be. And the most damning of all, one that read, "Meet me tonight. We need to talk. You know what's at stake." There was no coming back from that. The final piece of evidence was found during the forensic examination of Ethan's home. Traces of soil from his boots were found to match the dirt from Sofia's grave site. Investigators also found hair strands in the back of his truck that were a perfect DNA match to Sofia. At this point, the evidence was undeniable. A warrant was issued. And Ethan Thompson, once a respected officer, was placed in handcuffs outside his home as his wife and daughters looked on in stunned horror. The courtroom was packed on the first day of Ethan's trial. Reporters, legal analysts, and members of the community filled every available seat, their eyes fixed on the man who had once been trusted to uphold the law. For Alejandro, the sight of Ethan in an orange jumpsuit, shackled and stripped of the authority he once held over them, should have brought relief. But there was no relief, no sense of triumph, only rage and unbearable grief. The man who had stolen his sister's life sat just feet away from him, still carrying the same cold arrogance he had the day he reassured Alejandro that he would handle Sofia's disappearance. Prosecutors laid out every piece of evidence in brutal detail. The surveillance footage. The text messages. The forensic findings. They painted a picture of a man who had carefully planned his crime, who had lured a vulnerable girl into a trap, who had suffocated her and buried her like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. Ethan's defense team tried to argue that the relationship had been consensual, that Sofia had been troubled, that there was no direct proof tying him to the murder itself. But the jury wasn't convinced. The sheer weight of evidence was overwhelming. Then came the moment no one expected. Halfway through the trial, when it became clear that his conviction was inevitable, Ethan broke. Perhaps it was the weight of his own guilt. Perhaps it was the realization that there was no escaping justice. But on the stand, in front of the entire courtroom, he confessed. He admitted to the affair. He admitted to killing Sofia. He described, in chilling detail, how he had planned it, how he had carried it out, and how he had expected to get away with it. His voice was flat, detached, as if he were reading off a script rather than confessing to murder. The courtroom fell silent as his words sank in. Alejandro sat frozen, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The moment was surreal. The man who had deceived them, who had manipulated them, was now admitting everything. And yet, it didn't bring Sofia back. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. Ethan Thompson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict sent shockwaves through the community. People who had once respected him, who had trusted him to enforce the law, now saw him for what he truly was, a predator hiding behind a badge. His wife and daughters left town, unable to bear the shame of his crimes. His former colleagues distanced themselves, horrified by what he had done. But for Alejandro, the nightmare didn't end with the trial. His sister was gone. His parents, who had sent them to the U.S. hoping they would find safety, were left grieving from thousands of miles away. The trial was over. The man responsible for Sofia's death had been convicted, his fate sealed within the cold walls of a maximum security prison. But justice, as Alejandro quickly learned, did not bring peace. The weight of his sister's absence lingered in every quiet moment, every empty space where she once stood. There were nights when he still expected to hear her voice, to see her walking through the door, to feel the warmth of a sibling's bond that had once made the world seem just a little less cruel. But that world had changed forever. With Ethan Thompson sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the legal battle was over. Yet, Alejandro's fight had only just begun. In the wake of Sofia's murder, Alejandro found himself at a crossroads. He could have disappeared into the shadows, swallowed by grief and fear, just as so many undocumented immigrants did when faced with injustice. But Sofia's memory refused to let him stay silent. A visa, granted to victims of certain crimes who assist law enforcement in investigations, allowed Alejandro to remain in the United States legally. It was meant to offer protection, to give him a path forward. But for Alejandro, it became more than that, it became a mission. Through the help of advocacy groups, he was connected with others who had suffered similar abuses, young women manipulated by men in power, families torn apart by exploitation, voices silenced by fear of deportation. The more stories he heard, the more he realized that Sofia was not the only victim. There were others, many others, who had never received justice. He refused to let Sofia's death be just another statistic. Determined to make a difference, Alejandro, along with a coalition of immigration advocates and legal experts, founded the Sofia Morales Foundation, an organization dedicated to protecting immigrant women and families from the very kind of abuse that had stolen his sister's life. The foundation worked to provide shelter, legal aid, and psychological support for those at risk. It helped expose officers and authority figures who preyed on vulnerable individuals, ensuring they were held accountable for their crimes. It became a beacon of hope for those who had once believed they had nowhere to turn. But Alejandro knew that no matter how many lives the Foundation changed, it would never bring Sofia back. Her name was now etched into the fight for justice, a reminder of what had been taken, and what still needed to be done. While Alejandro built something in Sofia's name, the family Ethan had spent years protecting, his wife, his daughters, the image of a respectable home, crumbled beneath the weight of his actions. Sharon Thompson, the woman who had once stood by his side, left town with their 2 daughters, unable to bear the shame of what he had done. The man she had trusted, the father her children had adored, had become a monster in the eyes of the world. Neighbors who had once waved at Ethan from their driveways now refused to speak his name. The community that had once held him in high regard as a law enforcement officer turned their backs on him, unwilling to associate with the disgrace he had brought upon them. His daughters, too young to fully understand the depth of his betrayal, would grow up with a name they could never escape, a name forever tied to corruption, manipulation, and murder. And as Ethan sat in his prison cell, stripped of his badge, his power, his control, he was left with nothing but the weight of what he had done. There were no more excuses, no more lies to tell. Only the cold reality of the life he had destroyed and the prison walls that would keep him from ever hurting another person again. But was it enough? Sofia Morales had fled her home country seeking safety. Instead, she had found something far worse, an enemy disguised as a protector, a man who saw her desperation as an opportunity for control. And she was not the only one. How many others had suffered the same fate? How many officers, trusted to uphold the law, had exploited their power in the shadows? And how many victims had never been found, never had their voices heard, never had justice served? It's a question that lingers long after the verdict is read, after the headlines fade, after the world moves on. And it's a question that demands an answer. So, tell me, how many more officers are abusing their power right now, hidden behind a badge? And how many victims will never get the justice they deserve? Let me know in the comments below. And if this was your sister, your family, what would you have done?